Over on Substack, the Unsolicited Advice Reading Group are currently reading Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. If you'd like to join us, the link is in the description. Right, Dr. Walter Veit, welcome to Solicited Advice.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Wonderful. I think this is going to be really good fun. You've written a very exciting blog post recently on Substack critiquing analytic philosophy and some of its shortcomings. So to open this, where do you think philosophy has gone wrong?
Oh, great question. I mean, you could probably identify the linguistic turn, but I don't want to paint it in too broad strokes. I mean, there were many things very beneficial about the linguistic turn, where philosophers started to think more about language, how we communicate with each other and so forth, and perhaps identify some problems as kind of fake, really disagreements about how terms should be used rather than disagreements about nature itself. But what I tried to do with my blog post was to identify naturalist philosophy as really a different kind of philosophy altogether. Usually you make comparisons perhaps between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. But I really wanted to say, look, naturalistic philosophy isn't just this tiny bit of analytic philosophy where some philosophers look at the sciences to make claims, but it's a different methodology altogether where, well, you kind of reject the analysis of language as the goal of philosophy, and you're much more concerned with going back to the origins of philosophy, trying to understand the world as such. And of course, you can be interested in trying to understand how people use concepts and so forth. But in that case, you would want to use experimental philosophy. You would want to use psychological methods, employ these in order to understand how ordinary people think about how terms should be used, rather than just ask one philosopher what their intuitions are about a concept, right?
And you've talked about intuition there. This is one of the classic battlegrounds over which naturalistic and more classic analytic philosophers tend to fight. What does it mean when an analytic philosopher appeals to intuition to justify something? And how would they view that as an epistemically defensible position?
Yeah, so I mean, you get a diversity of views, but you could certainly identify the spectrum where strongly naturalist philosophers like myself think intuition is very often flawed and actually not as trustworthy as we would want it to be in order to understand reality. So if you want to understand perhaps how a particular term should be used, like health, you might introspect in how we use it usually. But if you want to understand a natural phenomenon of health, you would want to look at medicine, perhaps veterinary science and so forth, in order to understand what it means for a biological entity to be healthy. And intuitions, very often lead us astray, and scientists certainly have to learn that. I mean, if you study any of the sciences, very quickly, early in your education, you'll be taught, don't trust your intuitions too much. Please learn these experimental methods, statistics, and so forth. And things might seem really counterintuitive, but actually, they're true. You also get that in sciences like economics, where a lot of students come in and they look at, say, game theoretic examples like a prisoner's dilemma, and they say, well, why don't they just cooperate? And they don't understand the structure of the game. Perhaps some models in economics are very counterintuitive of what perhaps is the optimal, say, tax policy, because, well, sometimes values conflict. If you hold strong values about perhaps what you think society should be designed, and you might expect different policies to be optimal. But values can conflict there with what the science says actually works better sometimes.
And to give a kind of classic example of how intuition is sometimes used in philosophy, we can look at something like philosophical zombies as an example of intuition style argument from philosophy of mind, which is where someone says, okay, it seems like you could picture a being, you could conceive of a being that has all of the same physical characteristics and behaves exactly like an ordinary human being, but nonetheless it has no consciousness, it has no what we might call qualitative experience, or use any of the adjacent highly contested terms for this. And some philosophers will occasionally appeal to this to suggest that, in fact, consciousness is not identical and cannot be identical to a certain set of physical states. And so that's just one way in which, this argument can be, I would argue, deceptively persuasive, because it really seems like this conceivability can get you access to a genuine physical possibility out in the world. What would be one way in which that intuition could be unseated by a naturalistic discovery?
Great. So I think in the case of consciousness, analytic philosophers trying to aim at intuitions, defending them, I think have sort of the best case, the strongest example where they can defend their position, because you get phenomenology mixed in, right? And rather than trying to say, look, oh, how do we use the term health? I think about, well, the kind of cases where the concept might apply, a broken bone, perhaps a start of baldness, does that count as disease or so forth? And well, much more clearly there it seems it's what we should look at is how society uses perhaps the term. But when it comes to consciousness, well, subjective experiences, well, those are our own experiences. So it seems like intuition perhaps gets a kind of priority there. And they're not completely wrong. I mean, our own experience is data we should definitely account for in having a scientific account of consciousness. But when it comes to thought experiments like zombies that are functionally completely analogous to conscious entities, but then we can imagine them without experience, well, firstly, you can question, well, if they're exactly the same in the kind of physical machinery, the organization, well, wouldn't they then also have experience? You can ask yourself that perhaps with AI systems, what if you build a complex machine that instantiates a brain kind of perfectly, more or less, but then a machinery is a bit different. Rather than using biological material, use silicon. You might think, well, if it's functionally the same, perhaps we also have experiences there. Some people think maybe the biological matter plays a role here in their experiences, and that might very well be true. But the intuition really doesn't tell us much because, of course, philosophers disagree on the intuition of whether zombies are metaphysically possible or not. There's much disagreement. And what you really want to look at then is experimental data, right? Try to build similar systems. And perhaps that is a much better a way of thinking about such cases. But really, for naturalist philosophers like myself, we think thought experiments like zombies are kind of useless because they're already designed to favor a particular conclusion. And you can very easily construct a different thought experiment that favors physicalism, say, rather than kind of consciousness priority view.
So there's a kind of parity that you can have where you end up with lots of different intuitions piling up on either side. And the idea for the naturalist philosopher is that, you just turn to the experimental method as a tried and tested way to arbitrate between these intuitions. I think it's really interesting you bring up there that consciousness seems like if intuition was going to be a deciding vote anywhere, it would be in consciousness. And I was just wondering, do you have any ready-to-hand examples of where we thought something intuitive about consciousness and then this was unseated by a naturalistic discovery that we've already made?
Yeah, I think there are several examples. I mean, for one, we think of consciousness as this immediate experience. We immediately experience what happens in the world. But then if you look at the neuroscience of how quickly information is processed in the brain, how quickly we react to it, well, it turns out consciousness is actually fairly slow. And for many things we do as cognitive agents, a lot of information is processed in the back, so to speak, right? And our consciousness, in a way, is then as privileged. I don't want to use the term observer, really, but we get this filtered information in order to have a useful way of engaging with the world. You can think of it as a kind of simulation or model, but it's not direct at all. And so that's one of the way science, you might think of the Libet type experiments, has shown how consciousness is not direct. There's other experiments about vision. We usually think that, say, if I were to ask people whether they think they can see clearly what they see at the edge of their vision, they think, yeah. But then if you experimentally test them, they quickly learn, well, they can't. And another experiment I like to use with my students, which very often shocks them, is have you heard of aphantasia?
Is that where you can't picture things? Have I got that right?
That's right. There's popular images. You might try to bring up one on the screen when it goes online, where you have a question. You ask people, well, close your eyes and imagine an apple. And so hopefully viewers now will close their eyes for a few seconds, imagine an apple, and now open your eyes, and here's a picture of several apples, and more or less detailed, either a completely black picture, and then to the range, you get a shape here, and here's a perfect apple, like a photographic image. And it turns out different people will fall differently here in how well they can imagine it with a closed eyes. And it turns out I have aphantasia for one. And I used to think, well, when people speak of an inner image, this internal mind, they used it metaphorically, because what else would they mean? But it turns out I was completely mistaken. Many people can actually imagine things when they close their eyes. And for me, it's mostly black, which is unfortunate. I mean, I would like to say, close my eyes, imagine flying through the sky, feeling the wind on my skin. Some people have great imaginative skills, and they actually have something very close to actual experience there. I'm quite jealous, in fact. A benefit might be, say, if something very traumatic happens in your life, people with aphantasia are probably better off because they don't remember it as well.
That's really interesting.
And so, yeah, there's many cases where our own experiences give us a wrong sense of what experience is like, and especially for other people.
Yes, yeah. So, like, if somebody without aphantasia was to reflect intuitively on what it means to have a mind, I mean, a classic picture that is often brought up is this kind of Cartesian theater. You are sitting there in the back seat, and experience is displayed before you, including inner and outer experience, as if in a theater. And aphantasia is one way of saying, no, actually, this is mistaken, like empirically mistaken. That is not how consciousness manifests for some people. That's absolutely fascinating. So, in your post on this, you talk a little bit about how this naturalistic philosophy crosscuts the analytic continental distinction as it's normally conceived. First of all, I'd love for you to say a little bit, for those who might not be as familiar with it, what this analytic continental distinction is, and then how naturalistic philosophy really doesn't comfortably fit as kind of a subsection of analytic philosophy, even though that might be how it's emerged kind of contingently in the academy, and how it actually, borrows quite a lot of continental philosophies, or continental philosophers could be considered to be broadly naturalistic thinkers.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. I mean, before I went to university to study philosophy, most of the philosophy I read would have been considered continental. I mean, it depends maybe where you would locate some philosophers, like Kant, for example, who went from a continental philosopher gradually towards the canon of being considered an analytic philosopher. But if you have people like Nietzsche, say, or the existentialists, they're very thoroughly considered continental philosophers. And so when I went to university, very quickly we were told, well, this is a university where we focus on analytic philosophy. And initially I didn't know what that was, but we had a professor, Rainer Hexelmann. He gave a very nice introduction. In fact, you might not know that, but a lot of the logical empiricists, say, who were involved in the early birth and origins of analytic philosophy, they were living in Germany, and many were Jewish, and they were forced to leave Germany, of course, during the Nazi period. And one thing the Nazis did, and it was a beautiful slide by my professor, where he put up some of the propaganda put out against this analytic philosophy. I mean, they didn't use the word analytic philosophy, they called it Jewish philosophy. And it had properties like, it had no respect before the deeper truths. It didn't hold itself back, asking the questions about meaning and religion and so forth, whereas German philosophy was more spiritual. And all the properties, he said, listed here as the good properties of German philosophy were actually bad properties you don't want from philosophy. And the analytic properties, like clear argumentation, that's something you really want. And so analytic philosophers very much had an opposition to what they saw in continental philosophy as, a lot of, you could use the word bullshit. It's very unclear, the argumentation. What are the arguments the people are actually making? Kind of storytelling. metaphors and so forth, but very unclear. Well, what do people mean? And if you were to try to nail them down on what their position actually is, it might be very unclear. And perhaps continental philosophers today, they try to get this expertise and also try to speak in a similar way where you want to sound perhaps very intelligent, use very sophisticated language, but not necessarily much meaning behind it if you try to analyze it. And where analytic philosophers very much wanted to say, look, you can express yourself simple. It's a very Anglo-centric view of doing philosophy. It's trying to express your ideas as clearly as possible. It also reflects a bit cultural differences. I mean, in Germany, for instance, if a professor if the students don't understand what the professors teach them, very often the blame is put on the students, right? Well, you're just not smart enough. You don't listen enough. Just think more about the words your professor is trying to put into your soul. But in the Anglosphere, I mean, if you as a professor fail to explain something to your students, it's seen as a failure of you. You're just not explaining it well enough. And analytic philosophers try to make the arguments as clear as possible. And that's definitely a benefit of analytic philosophy. And that's not what I'm trying to criticize. In fact, a lot of contemporary analytic philosophy, if you look at journals, very often it's very jargony, needless formalisms, needless definitions, not at all as clear as possible. And where do I see naturalistic philosophy here? Well, if you think of analytic philosophy as this analysis of language, where it's more focused on intuitions, and philosophy is something with a sharp boundary from other disciplines, the sciences. If you think about philosophy as something that had to protect itself historically, the emergence of psychology suddenly took hold on a lot of topics philosophers thought was their own domain. Philosophers were urged to perhaps try to identify a certain set of methods that make philosophy unique. And I think that's a problem. I think philosophy is about certain very more abstract questions that concern reality in a more general way, where we take a step back and ask these questions about, say, the meaning of life, what is consciousness, what is morality, and so forth, rather than, say, a scientist who's more concerned perhaps with the more narrow. And so you get a nice difference here between philosophy in this historical sense and analytic philosophy, where analytic philosophy nowadays is also very often concerned with very narrow questions where people ask, what are we even doing here? What's the benefit to society? No one outside of our discipline would read this. You just get small tweaks to particular definitions of terms, perhaps. Other philosophers come up with counterexamples to that. The definition is tweaked again. And there's some horrific papers to look at where you get definitions that go perhaps an entire page, and it's quite terrible. Where naturalistic philosophy I see quite differently. Naturalistic philosophy is about also these questions, these philosophical questions we're interested in. What is consciousness? How does it work? And rather than think of particular methods, conceptual analysis, just trying to dissect concepts and perhaps try to understand the boundaries of how we use terms, well, that's not how we understand consciousness. I mean, unless we already have a perfect understanding of what it is, why should we expect our terms to perfectly capture it, right? And so instead, you draw on all the sciences and get this broader picture of the evidence coming in from different disciplines, try to bring it together. And sometimes the term synthetic philosophy is used. I don't know if you've come across that. So if analytic philosophy is about trying to dissect things, synthetic philosophy is about trying to bring things together. Put them together, you have perhaps a puzzle piece provided by the different sciences, also evidence from our ordinary experiences, and try to bring it all together to create a picture of the world, a better model in order to understand the world better. And that's ultimately what philosophy is interested in. And naturalistic philosophy just makes use of what the sciences provide us with. It doesn't reject it. It tries to make the best account compatible with the sciences to understand the world we live in and our place within it.
I think you make a really good distinction there between the sort of genuine benefits that we've inherited from the analytic approach, things like clarity and a certain rigor in thinking, and then also the shortcomings, where sometimes I've heard the phrase before used as the imitation of rigor, which I think is a wonderful way to put, because there's nothing inherently wrong with having, complex argumentation or complex definitions, but I think that a lot of the time this complexity can become unmoored from our most successful way of studying the world, which is empirical science. And I think that, naturalistic philosophy seems like a great way to redress that balance. An interesting, again, point about how naturalistic philosophy cross-cuts the analytic continental distinction is that there are some continental thinkers that do engage in what at least I would call a naturalistic analysis. I mean, I'm thinking largely of Nietzsche here because of Brian Leiter's work on him. Brian Leiter coming up with this incredibly sophisticated interpretation of Nietzsche, whereby Nietzsche is a methodological naturalist who is speculating on the best empirical grounds at the time as to how the human mind works, and coming up with a kind of a very early form of derived psychology through doing that. So I think that a nice thing to bring out would be that you're not saying that philosophy doesn't have any jobs to do now. In fact, it seems like, a really great thing that I think distinguishes your approach from a lot of simple doom and gloom proclamations that sometimes come out of analytic philosophy, where people say, "Oh, the whole field is dead. It's not doing anything. It's just all idle now." Is that actually you're saying, no, philosophy still has work that it's well suited towards doing. It's just that the work is of a different kind.
That's right. And in fact, increasingly so, as the sciences become more specialized, as scientists working in particular niches within science don't really know what goes perhaps on in the lab over there. No, knowledge is so niche, so expertise focused on a particular area. You actually need more philosophers to have this broader perspective and try to integrate in order to synthesize knowledge in order to build this model of the world. And I apologize. You asked me to compare continental philosophy and naturalistic philosophy. I forgot to go into that. But in my essay, I mentioned Nietzsche, Brian Leiter, as one good case where Brian Leiter really shows that Nietzsche wasn't just interested in what is sometimes criticized. Oh, you're not really philosophy. There's just a lot of metaphors going on. No, Nietzsche wanted to offer a psychological account. Also a precursor like William James really to psychology. I mean, surely with more experimental data nowadays, his views would be different, definitely. You also get that in the work of, say, Owen Flanagan with Buddhist philosophy. I mean, it's not just continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. There's philosophy outside the European continent. And I mean, we have neglected that, certainly. There's a lot of very interesting ideas that are worth exploring, especially when it comes to thinking that our intuitions really reflect reality. Well, turns out across cultures, intuitions aren't shared at all. They can reflect all kinds of different views. In China, concepts of the mind, of consciousness will be very different. India again. So that kind of experimental work actually undermines a lot of the assumptions that go into defending analytic philosophy. And when I say that a naturalist philosophy is more interested in system building, that's something continental philosophers were very interested in. Perhaps too much, right? One philosopher comes along and tries to reject the whole worldview of the previous philosopher, trying to create a complete different system. And analytic philosophers were right that seems misguided. In the sciences, you don't just replace one theory with another. No, you make incremental improvements. And there's a lot of meaningful work to be done improving models and theories. And more similarly, I think we should do it here. And naturalistic philosophers certainly don't just try to provide this completely new world view of reality. No, we incrementally work together with scientists in order to improve our understanding of the world, especially how it relates to ourselves. And other continental philosophers perhaps worth highlighting here would be someone like Edmund Husserl, who were very interested in biology and so forth. And continental philosophers, just because they write in a different style doesn't mean they're not interested in these different questions. And very often, actually, analytic philosophers also discarded the value of metaphors and so forth, because in science, metaphors very often play very important roles. You might think of Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. That metaphor was quite important in order to help biologists rethink how genes work, how biology works and operates, and so forth. And metaphors are extremely common, actually, in scientific papers, which, if you haven't read one ever, you might think, no, it's just all statistics and math. No, not at all. Metaphors play a useful role.
I think that it also seems to me, at the very least from my cursory knowledge of the history of science, that metaphorical understandings of complex and deeply unintuitive scientific theories can be very helpful just psychologically in people coming up with new ways of looking at the world. I'm thinking here about, the thought experiments done by Galileo, going way back, but also Einstein, characteristically, what would it look like if I was running at the speed of light next to a beam of light? What would I see? Being a sort of, that's not in the theory of special relativity, but it's part of the psychological process that caused him to come up with that. So I think that I agree with you in the sense that I think metaphors seem to be important, if nothing else, simply because how we make the world clear in everyday terminology affects how we then theorize about it when we're going back into our more fine-grained, heavy-going, hard-nosed, I suppose you might call it, scientific inquiry about the world. An interesting point, again, something I've seen you write about, is that this is one potential benefit of going into our study of mind with a kind of physicalist underlying assumption. Because, I've spoken before about how I don't call myself a physicalist because that's too much metaphysics for me. Because I think that it's kind of, it's or seems pragmatically dispensable, because we never make touch with, the fact that it's physical matter seems kind of extraneous to the observations being made. But a really interesting point that you made, which has kind of shifted my position on this, is that nonetheless, conceiving of it all as physical will change the way you theorize. And that is a pragmatically useful effect of a seemingly abstract metaphysical position.
Yeah, I agree. Funnily enough, yesterday my wife was in Oxford to give a talk on zoopsychism, that animals are the only entities conscious. And Philip Goff also gave a talk on panpsychism. And really, my essay on analytic philosophy came out of an initial essay I wrote against panpsychism, where panpsychists accused physicalists of having these strong metaphysical assumptions going into their work. And really, we might provide perhaps a very different metaphysical view, where consciousness is fundamental. But that's not really how I think about naturalist philosophers usually engaged in these discussions. We don't start out doing a lot of metaphysical work to defend physicalism and then try to look at the sciences in order to make sense of consciousness. Not at all. Many philosophers, like, say, James Ladyman, Don Ross, think there is no metaphysics of this kind to be done. That would
Everything must
completely pointless. Everything must go. That's right. Metaphysics must be naturalized itself. And in that sense, it's much more about inference to the best explanation. We look at the sciences, and physicalism then is more of a view of, well, based on the best science we have, our basic kind of physicalist model of the mind is probably the best, but that doesn't come along with strong intuitions, say, about billiard balls flying into each other. No. Whatever the best science tells you, matter might ultimately come down to, there's a lot of electric signaling going on in the brain. There's a lot of wet wear. It's incredibly complex, all of it, the chemistry of it. We continue to learn more and more. And we used to think, the brain will be very simple to understand. Neuroscience will understand it in a few decades. But no, now we realize, oh gosh, maybe the brain is the most complex system in the world to try to understand. And so my metaphysics here really is just, well, we should be much more interested in epistemology. How can we gain knowledge about any of these things? And to try to think that we can gain knowledge in the fundamental structure of reality just by introspecting, trying to think of these fundamental categories, essences, and so forth, and then trying to push that on the sciences. That I think is completely misguided as a strongly naturalist philosopher. Yeah.
I think that it's another interesting effect of making the physicalist metaphysics, if you choose to adopt one downstream of this methodological naturalism, is that you're not saying that it's all that there's this metaphysical physical stuff that everything's made out of and that needs a kind of definition. You're more saying that no, like it seems like everything that we observe falls into a set of things that form linear causal chains that you can interact with, and you can intervene at one level of the causal chain and affect something further down the causal chain, and that we're sort of, and so far everything that we've been able to get our hands on and do stuff with is of this characteristic that we've called physical. But that you're open to the idea that one day if we could do things with non-physical stuff, then naturalistic philosophers would be quite happy to become non-physicalist. That the physicalism is in some sense extraneous to the overall point here.
That's right. I mean, once we have more evidence for alternatives view, that should ultimately change the minds of naturalistic philosophers. But of course, our very understanding of matter has shifted over time because of revolutions in the physical sciences, physics especially. And so future science might accommodate perhaps a very different understanding of matter that currently doesn't seem to accommodate the mind. But of course, just how we change our view on what matter is. Our understanding of the mind has shifted radically over time because of neuroscience, because of the computational revolution, artificial intelligence, and so forth. We keep learning more. And so, yes, if we just think of these categories we once had and try to push them onto these rapid shifts within science, often they don't fit. But yes, we should just adopt different categories, shift our definitions in order to match the best science rather than our intuitions about things.
And I think that not only have you been a proponent of naturalist philosophy or naturalistic philosophy as an overall approach, a lot of your work is effectively an example of this in practice. What you're best known for academically is probably studying the implications of evolutionary science on our way of viewing consciousness. Would you mind just giving a bit of background to what got you started on that overall approach? Why is it that you think that evolutionary science specifically has so much to offer our study of the mind?
Great. Now, let's see. How far do we want to go back? One thing I saw in philosophy very early when reading the work of people like Dennett was that work was pretty rare. The naturalistic philosophy I'm interested in is pretty niche in philosophy, which is why people usually just see it as this little part of analytic philosophy. And I mean, I did a PhD in the history, history and philosophy of science school at the University of Sydney, and philosophy of science is very often seen as a kind of perhaps part of analytic philosophy where you analyze the concepts of the sciences, concepts like genes, also concepts like consciousness, as well as the methods of the sciences, try to improve them marginally, try to examine perhaps the assumptions scientists make in their theorizing. But that wasn't really what I was interested in per se. I didn't want to look at some specific study and try to put this critic hat on. Here, I'm a philosopher coming in, trying to tell scientists how they should do their work better. In a sense, I mean, not unjustifiably. I mean, a lot of scientists rightly can be skeptical about that work. I mean, philosophers of science need to prove themselves that they actually can contribute usefully to the sciences. And sometimes philosophy of science in several fields has become more niche, where philosophers of science just engage with each other in discussions rather than try to actually intervene with the sciences. And I think that's pretty negative. I mean, philosophy of science should really have an impact on the sciences. But there is another sense in which one could think of the philosophy of science, where philosophy is less concerned with the narrow and more with the broad, trying to bring in evidence together, as I mentioned, to make sense of these old philosophical questions. And that's very much what I saw in the work of Dennett. And I wanted to do that kind of philosophy. But I saw many philosophers, they didn't really do this perhaps on the later stages of their career. First, you got to write the kind of traditional analytic philosophy. And that's actually why I went to the University of Sydney to do a PhD there with Peter Godfrey Smith and Paul Griffiths, who are these philosophers of biology, who are very interested in actually trying to contribute to the sciences, trying to think especially about evolution, because as Dennett wrote in Darwin's Dangerous Idea, philosophers have really underestimated the importance of Darwinian evolution to a lot of philosophical questions. I mean, many philosophical questions are about humans, our free will, perhaps, our minds, and so forth. But of course, we are a product of evolution. So if you want to understand our place in nature, well, which theory could have more of an impact then on understanding our place in the universe than Darwinian evolution? And yet, a lot of philosophers historically have been quite skeptical, quite anti-Darwinian, in fact, and that's quite unfortunate. And so that's why I wanted to get deep into the philosophy of biology, really try to understand evolutionary biology. And in my undergrad, in philosophy and economics, I mean, didn't really have anything to do with that. I was lucky enough to be allowed to do an internship at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology, because that's where I saw how philosophy could make the most progress. First, you need to understand evolution really well. I mean, you shouldn't just, I don't know, have some cursory understanding of evolutionary biology and then use that to speculatively support some philosophical arguments. No, you should do it in more sophisticated ways. I mean, there is some shoddy philosophy where sometimes philosophers, I don't know, cite some random study that might support the view in some sense, but not really deeply engaged with the scientific literature, which is unfortunate because we know, because of the replication crisis, that there's very often, say in psychology, research that supports one view, but then more experiments that support a completely opposite view. And so you shouldn't just cherry pick your data here. You should actually be more involved with a literature analysis if you actually draw on the scientific literature. So that's why I wanted to become a philosopher of biology, because in order to understand something like consciousness, so complex, we probably can make the most progress here by trying to push it through this filter of evolutionary biology. Think about, well, there's so many views of consciousness out there, right? All the way from consciousness is nowhere, which some think of illusionism this way, towards everywhere, a kind of panpsychist view. How could we constrain so many theories of consciousness? It seems like everyone, well, at least a fraction of physicists winning Nobel Prizes, then they decide it's time for me to get into this debate on consciousness, try to provide my own theory. I don't know how helpful that is. But there's so many theories out there. And so evolution provides a very nice constraint on what theories are the most plausible. If you think of consciousness as something that would have gradually evolved towards this very complex form we find in ourselves, but might not reflect consciousness as it exists across most of nature, right? We could be this very idiosyncratic, special case. Our minds could be quite radically different from other animals. And that's quite plausible, right? Why would consciousness in other animals exist in the same form? And what we might consider as the most important about human consciousness, well, that might have very little to do with what is fundamental to consciousness in other cases.
So, in some sense, your kind of project here is to think, what is it that evolutionarily explains why we have this thing that we've decided to call consciousness? And moreover, that evolutionary explanation might be really quite different to what happens when we sit down and we think, okay, what do I think is fundamental to consciousness? Because some of the the answers that have been given to that question classically are things like, oh, I think rationality is fundamental to consciousness, or I think that self-awareness is fundamental to consciousness. These are the kinds of answers that sometimes occur when we sit down and think about them, and when I've sat down and thought about it, right? But there's also something deeply anthropomorphic about it. I can see that when I go into my little internal Cartesian theatre and say, try to summon up what I think is important or fundamental to consciousness, I am in some sense talking more about what I most value about being conscious, rather than saying anything necessarily about what consciousness is in terms of this shared property that we seem to have with corvids and cephalopods and mice. So the evolutionary approach here seems to be to sort of get behind that and sort of try to chart out what might be fundamental to consciousness through this linear causal chain.
So completely, I agree. I mean, it's really good that we had this analytic philosophy discussion beforehand, because, well, intuitions about the human case clearly seem unreliable, even if you think about other humans. We had this case of aphantasia. I mean, when I close my eyes, my experiences are very different from other people, right? But why would anyone think that our introspection would tell us something about the experiences of other animals, what their experiences must be like? No, no, no. I mean, our intuitions there would be far less reliable, right? And because of that, it's really dangerous to take this anthropocentric view and think that our intuitions must reflect how consciousness must be in nature. And we need to flip that and think much more about a kind of bottom-up approach. And in my book, A Philosophy for the Science of Animal Consciousness, which was born out of my PhD thesis on the evolution of consciousness, really my goal was to, well, I mean, the book, many people look at a title like that and I think, oh, yeah, okay, there's human consciousness and here's a nice book on animal consciousness. Yeah, but humans are animals. And really my goal was that, look, no, we need to think about animal consciousness as the phenomenon of interest. That's what we need to study in order to make progress on consciousness. And that's a very different view than thinking, oh, let's just study human consciousness. And animals will fall out of that eventually. We'll understand what their minds are like. It's a completely different view. It's a paradigm shift, right? You move from a top-down approach, trying to study humans and apply these theories to animals, which is questionable the further you move away in the evolutionary tree of life from us, towards a different bottom-up approach where you think about, well, what is the most minimal kind of conscious experience that might have arisen? You think about, well, of all these properties of consciousness, what are the most basic? Try to dissect consciousness and think about how it could have gradually evolved with things put on top and perhaps looking very differently in other animals. And that then gives you perhaps a much better understanding of the origin of mind and a much better understanding ultimately of our own minds.
And I mean, that does seem to make sense as an approach, right? Even naively, in that it sometimes seems like, attempting to get at what might be fundamental to this broader thing called consciousness by looking just at the human mind, considering how incredibly complex it is, seems a little bit like attempting to explain shapes by handing someone like a graduate level topology book and being like, right, somewhere in here you'll get like the fundamental theory of what holes are. But don't give them the introductory textbook. Don't try and make things simpler. No, just like launch in with something incredibly complicated and try and get down to the simple case from that. I mean, yeah, it seems like at the very least another approach might be more fruitful, that of starting with the simple and building up from there. What was it that because in your book you go through a very, very detailed theory of what you think evolutionary pressures led to conscious experience and different ways of measuring it. Why do you think it is that we're not philosophical zombies in a purely kind of causal sense?
Great. I mean, one way sometimes this question is raised is thinking about it in terms of the functions of consciousness and then distinguishing that from phenomenal consciousness. You could have all these mechanistic functional aspects, but perhaps without the phenomenology, without this qualitative feel. But if you think about consciousness from an evolutionary perspective, well, it's very easy then to realize, well, plausibly the functions of consciousness must be experienced, or at least benefit from being experienced. That's part of why they're functional in order to work. If things didn't feel painful, if things didn't feel pleasurable, if you didn't feel these motivations, well, then they would be less powerful. It's precisely because of this experiential aspect that they benefit us. And in the human case, we quite easily forget that because we have so much imagination. I mean, it's very easy for humans to go insane, right? I mean, our imagination can go anywhere. And you can also see that in philosophy. I mean, philosophers can imagine all kinds of things. They can build these castles in the sky, and it's quite impressive, the theories some philosophers come up with. I mean, beautiful sometimes even, but unfortunately not necessarily reflecting reality. And similarly with our imagination, dreams, and the like, it's easy to think, well, consciousness must just exist for its own sake. Perhaps humans are the special creature on Earth, and we have minds equipped to perhaps deal with, take care of the planet or something along this line. But just because human social life is so complex, I think it's easy to underestimate, well, if you didn't have all these aspects, you'd probably do worse, at least in our ancestral environments. And even though many of these aspects of idiosyncratic aspects of human consciousness might be hard to explain, when it comes to these more basic aspects, having any kind of sensory experiences, having any kind of sense of self, being able to distinguish your own body from the outside world, things feeling good or bad, those much more fundamentally see clearly as cases where why would a zombie like that exist if the actual function is to be experienced in this way, and if it wouldn't be as functional without that aspect. And that's one common evolutionary argument, actually, against zombies.
Mm. And one of the key factors that you identify in your book as kind of driving this evolutionary need for conscious experience is pathological complexity, which it would be wonderful just to hear a little bit about what that is and why it's so relevant for the evolution of consciousness.
Great. I mean, I mentioned health earlier on and how we should define it. And pathology suggests, oh, well, what could it be? Maybe a broken bone, something along those lines. And I had a great dissatisfaction with the philosophical debate on that, precisely because of these arguments earlier discussed in analytic philosophy. You get this one divide in the philosophy of medicine between so-called naturalists who try to define health and disease in terms of deviations from a norm, perhaps in the case of disease, and health then as the absence of pathological states, against sometimes social constructivists who think, well, no, it's a social category. Perhaps it's something we judge to be bad as a society. Then you get a historical account. Some others say, well, no, it's about what we should medicalize. Perhaps it's something that feels painful and so forth. Um, and that suffers from the very problems I highlighted earlier with analytic philosophy. I mean, why would conceptual analysis lead us to having a satisfying answer to these questions if there's these different goals to which a concept is put to use? It's very unfortunate that our language is actually polysemous by design.
Mm.
Our terms have many meanings, not because we are so bad at making up terms, but no, because that makes them more functional in ordinary usage. If our terms were as specifically, precisely defined as analytic philosophers would want them, I mean, we would need way more terms in order to communicate with each other, right?
Mm.
Unfortunately, that can often lead to confusions. But for ordinary discourse, for engaging with other humans, talking to each other, that vagueness is quite important.
Mm.
And so when it comes to health, then I said the naturalist, the so-called naturalists. Now, I don't think that a statisticalist definition of health is a naturalist one. There, you're just providing a conceptual analysis, perhaps, of how some medical professionals use a medical handbook or something along those lines. But no, that's really weird. I mean, why would you think that's a naturalist definition? You would want to identify a phenomenon, not just how medical practitioners use concepts. It's again this difference between looking at how some people use a term versus trying to identify a phenomenon in nature. So what's pathological complexity? Well, if you want to understand health as a natural phenomenon, it's about how well organisms deal with the species-specific pathological complexity. And you might have heard of the term Darwinian demon. Have you heard of that?
I've come across it, yeah. But I think that we'd all appreciate an explanation.
All right. So sometimes people have very naive views of biology. And one good way of trying to emphasize why particular species have weird adaptations and so forth, or very short lives, is to emphasize, well, if we could just design the perfect Darwinian creature, well, of course, it would live forever and it would have infinite offspring. That's the ideal Darwinian creature, right?
Mm.
But why can't that happen? Well, because there's trade-offs. I mean, in any design, if you want to implement this real system that recreates itself, well, it will have to face trade-offs. It will need energy, right? There's different ways of getting energy. Maybe you engaged in photosynthesis, living a plant-like life, being stationary. The downside of that is, well, you can't really escape if someone comes along and starts eating you. You could produce poison, though. Maybe that helps. Or needles, right? Perhaps this very thick, something like a thick armor, right? I mean, it's not that easy, perhaps, to eat a tree as it is to eat grass on the ground. And so when you think about biological systems, you should really think about them as a kind of strategy. Now, what is the goal of the strategy? Maximizing reproductive output. That's the goal of all biological systems. But when we look at nature, there's this great diversity of strategies in order to achieve this goal, right? And there's many trade-offs in order to do so. And a theory in biology to try to make sense of this is life history theory. Now, it's essentially an economic theory of the firm applied to biological systems. If you have a company and you're trying to, well, a company usually you might think, oh, it has this goal to perhaps maximize profit, right? Very simple. But then you have also reproductive or output functions where you might try to produce a certain kind of shoe, perhaps, or a fridge, a new computer. And you have to think about, well, where do we place factories? Where do we buy all the ingredients that go into that? That's quite similar to biological systems in the sense that, well, in order to, say, grow a thicker armor, well, you need more nutrients for that. That's costly, right? If you don't have enough of that, maybe you die. And it's very easy for people before they study, say, evolutionary biology to think it's very easy for biological systems to do all of that, to think biology just inevitably leads to more complexity, that systems will just, I mean, take humans. It was very easy for humans in the past to think, well, we're the peak of evolution, a natural endpoint. Biological evolution would just inevitably lead to smart creatures like us. Not so. I mean, we went extinct several times almost. And so it's quite lucky that we made it this far. We wouldn't have made it without all our brilliant innovations, right? And so pathological complexity is a species-specific problem for these different strategies we see, these different life history strategies of how to maximize reproductive output to deal with. And that's very species-specific. And that complexity can be higher or lower. So if you think, for instance, of a plant, very sessile, perhaps living a very simple life, a very short life cycle, that's a more simple strategy. If you have a longer life, if you have more years in which you're reproducing and so forth, the strategy already becomes more complex. You can think of it in this strategic sense, decision nodes. It's very useful here that the metaphors we can borrow from the human case of our strategic interactions. And really it's about then, well, naturalizing agency. we can recognize that different systems are more agent-like. They have these strategies that diverge, they have to make decisions. And one explosion that happened in the history of this pathological complexity was an evolution of animal life, 540 million years ago. This is when you get these more complex animal bodies with sensory apparatuses, appendages to deal with the world, very arthropod-like, right? All these tools attached to a body, very experimental. You get this explosion of a lot of different kinds of animal life. And why did we get this explosion? Biologists are puzzled about it. And I try to contribute part of an explanation here. In virtue of thinking, well, maybe consciousness was what enabled this increase in complexity, what enabled evolution to explore these more complex bodies. Now, have you heard of Moravec's paradox?
No.
All right. So initially in artificial intelligence research, what did people think would be the biggest problem?
Computation, I suppose?
Well, to replicate human intelligence, right? That was what people thought would be the hardest thing. It was things like beating humans at chess. It was writing a novel, perhaps coming up with music, making pictures, their creativity. And now it turns out those tasks were actually the easy ones. We can see these chatbots that get closer and closer to our human level performance. It causes existential crises in philosophers and, well, all other humans really, about our role in nature. What do we do once AIs can do all that? Well, but there's other tasks where AI researchers, that was seen as a kind of weak field. Things like building robots that can walk around without falling over. Well, people thought that would be easy. But not at all. Not at all. So, I mean, the smartest people in AI typically seem to go into fields like trying to replicate human intelligence. It was seen as the more prestigious field. But it turns out building robots that can move sophisticated ways, deal with these trade-offs, a complex body engaging with the world, that's much harder. And we're still struggling with that, though I see great strides in innovation there recently. Maybe you saw that video where a robot was taught to do kind of kung fu moves, and so maybe they're getting better. And in a perhaps kind of Skynet way, where you might think, well, maybe we shouldn't build robots like this. Anyway, so it turns out, well, that makes a lot of sense from biological evolution because, well, human intelligence was built over a time scale that is way shorter than this problem of moving a complex body around in an efficient manner. Clearly, having a complex body is a very costly investment. And costly investments very easily go extinct, like humans, for instance. We almost went extinct. And, well, so what happens around the Cambrian? Well, when you have this more complex body, and you have these complex decision problems, you get this problem of engaging with the right action at the right time, matching it with the right environmental stimuli, trying to approach food and so forth, escaping predators, right? Having these sensory systems that need to coordinate, incredibly complex. You get this explosion in life history complexity, what I call pathological complexity. These strategies become much more complex. And how can you deal with this complexity? Well, you need a common currency for decision making, something in which all this information is represented perhaps on this common scale, according to which different actions can be ranked in order to make the best decision. And here the idea is, well, maybe consciousness provided this ancient common currency, pleasure and pain. We get these what I call Benthamite creatures, named after the utilitarian Jeremy Bentham, who wasn't only interested in the utilitarian view that we should maximize happiness, but also in the psychological idea that the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain is really what psychologically drives us. Now, in the human case, this has gotten much more complex. I mean, we have these abstract goals we pursue and so forth. But in the animal case, that's quite accurate, which is why it was called a philosophy for swine, right? And so I think this is where we can make sense of consciousness, not just as a phenomenon that's really interesting for us to explain because it's so puzzling, but something that actually can help us to explain one of the most radical revolutions in the history of life. It helps us to understand how biological systems were able to suddenly experiment with this much greater complexity, experimenting with more complex bodily forms, because they had this common currency in order to make better decisions. And that was fine-tuned many times, and most of these organisms, of course, went extinct, but this capacity was fine-tuned and led to the subjectivity which we now see in many animals around us and also ourselves.
So the idea there is that this consciousness, this subjectivity, is a response to having to weigh up lots and lots of different decision pressures and needing to have a common ground on which to compare them, which for your account is pleasure and pain, or positively valenced experience and negatively valenced experience.
Exactly. And it's an agential complexity, right? The more complexity there is, well, the more you can describe this system as an agent. There's more decision problems. And so it makes a lot of sense then to think, well, of course, maybe this is how consciousness was driven, as a solution that became more and more complex in order to deal with these biological systems that became more agent-like.
And you talk about, in addition to kind of the two complexities that frame your book of pathological complexity and phenomenal complexity as a kind of almost a counterpart to it. Could you say a little bit about what phenomenal complexity is and also how these two complexities interact?
Sure. Now, we talked a bit about consciousness and how people might define it, the intuitions people have about it. And very often philosophers think of consciousness as this perhaps simple property that's very fundamental. And one thing I wanted to highlight with moving almost away from using the term consciousness, I mean, that's not something we can really do. But phenomenological complexity, I think, very much highlights even the state which we think is very simple, this the kind of what sometimes is called qualia or phenomenology. No, that's actually incredibly complex. There's a lot of properties that come together. And what we would really want to do is try to dissect consciousness into these different dimensions. And five that I was drawing on the work of philosopher Jonathan Birch, as well as the work of Nikki Clayton and Alex Schnell, biologists at Cambridge. They were interested in identifying these five dimensions in the case of animals, drawing also an earlier work in the case of humans, where in the case of, say, comatose patients, it wasn't as useful to just ask, well, is this unresponsive patient conscious or not? But, well, it seems, well, on those accounts, perhaps in these dimensions, it seems they're conscious, but in these other ones, they're not. And in order to understand these gradations, we really needed to move to a more multidimensional concept. And so, phenomenological complexity, what I see as a multidimensional view of consciousness, where we distinguish more dimensions: evaluative experience, sensory experience, which, of course, sensory experience can be divided into perhaps many, many more. The experience of time, the experience of how much things come together at a time, what I call the synchronic unity, the experience of a self-awareness, which might also include the experience of other minds. Do we have a sort of sense of what the experiences of others are? Are we using our own experience as a model for others? And when we get more fine-grained here, I think it's much easier to think about consciousness as something that gradually evolved across evolutionary time. And pathological complexity then can help us here in linking these properties that lead to increases in pathological complexity to increases in phenomenological complexity. I discussed several cases in my book. Recently, some biologists have responded, say in the case of elephants, there's particular pathological complexity challenges they face. You get these herds that have to in this quite large area, have to memorize the best paths to find food, water, and so forth. Also have to keep in mind where humans are. They need to memorize a lot of different places in order to move around. And so memory is really important. We would expect them then, in virtue of my framework, that they would have a significant phenomenological complexity. And then if you do research on their memory capacities, it turns out they're really complex. But you can also use research on the phenomenological experiences of animals to make predictions about what their life history challenges would be in the natural lives. And that can be quite useful, if you find, for instance, memory capacities to be quite good, well, that can give you predictions about, how complex usually their lives are, what they have to memorize. And turns out the memory capacities in corvids, crows, ravens, and the like are really good because they're very often engaged in hiding food for the future. Now, obviously, I'm very much into naturalist philosophy, but I don't just see that as a mission to try to read science, but actually become engaged with scientists. We briefly chatted a bit about someone you knew at Nikki Clayton's lab doing a PhD with corvids. And in fact, I spent almost half a year during my PhD at her lab trying to understand how people do these experiments in order to probe the minds of these animals. And a nice photograph by one of Nikki Clayton's PhD students ended up being the cover of my book. I really wanted to be engaged with scientists. I also went for almost half a year to the biology department in Oxford to work with life history theorists to really understand, well, how could this be measured and so forth. I'm still working with them, writing up a series of papers. This is how philosophy should be done. Ideally, according to me, you want to work together with scientists in order to make progress on these really difficult problems. Because, well, why would we think philosophy is something that just one person perhaps in a room can do? I mean, we have this old vision of people in their rooms locking themselves away, very isolating experience perhaps, coming up with these great ideas. But just like in the case of movies, when perhaps a director has a hit and then for future sequels they get more independence, the movies turn out to be worse. Well, it turns out there were more people involved, right? And so the same is true here. I mean, collaborative work with scientists and philosophers can be really useful to make progress on questions like consciousness. And yeah, when it comes to, I don't know, the experience, say, of a self, of a bodily self, you could make predictions. Kim Sterelny has made that if the environments, say, of larger primates are more complex, because if they try to swing alongside a very weak branch, it's much more likely that it will break. And also, there's more branches in the way of the body. They need a better sense of, well, how do they not just smash into another branch? They need to avoid that. And so it makes sense. You can make predictions about them having a better bodily self-experience. And that could in principle be tested against smaller animals like lemurs, say. And so I think the benefit of my framework is that we're not just speculating about experience, but we can make predictions about animals. And research into the mental capacities can also be used to make then predictions in the other way about their natural lives, about what the natural lives of these animals are like, which is important because you don't want to just study them in a lab environment. You want to see what these animals do in the wild. What did their minds evolve for? What are the problems they're trying to solve?
No, I think that's really interesting. So the pathological complexity will explain and predict in what dimensions animals are phenomenologically complex. And I think that, as you say, I think that's very important. I think that testability thing is pretty key because, as you've pointed out, it's very easy for stories that rely on evolutionary history to turn into sort of untestable, quite or just so stories is what they're often called. But so what are the kinds of experiments that you could run in order to, say, make predictions based on the pathological complexity of a creature's environment to what dimensions they will be phenomenologically complex in. Because on the face of it, naively, I imagine a lot of people listening to this will sort of go, well, how do we know? Because evolution happened, or, the majority of evolution happened so long in the past. None of us were around for it. So what are the kinds of experiments we can run to test this connection?
Good. I mean, one thing you can do, for instance, is look at closely related species, for instance. Well, in fact, it turns out even within a single species, life history strategies can differ widely. So the framework allows even for differences in experiences within a species, which could be explained within the framework. In fact, I mean, look at humans. I mean, very often we think, oh well, if you deviate from the norm, well, that's pathological. But it might be a kind of frequency-dependent solution where different kind of experiences might be more useful, where you would benefit from being perhaps part of the few who have this capacity. Sometimes it's very speculative, especially in the human case, because it's harder to test, right? Much harder in the human case, I think. So there, I think the charge of just soul stories, just storytelling, I think is a legitimate fear. We shouldn't just tell these stories. And some of the early origins of evolutionary psychology were pretty bad on that aspect, because, of course, as any young science, often very speculative claims, speculative theories, and not that much testing going on. And so that gave a very bad reputation to the field. I think it's much better now. But still, in the human case, it's very hard to test these things. Now, in the case of animals, however, actually, things are much easier. They don't have this complex, it's still very complex lives, but if you compare that to humans, we had another pathological complexity explosion, right? And that drove our experiences, which we might talk about a bit later. Let's focus on the animal case. Which species might you want to look at, say? For instance, the octopus, right? Now, octopuses are the weirdest when it comes to a sense of self, right? If you think about us, well, we can't just move our body in all kinds of ways. I mean, I'm very tall, almost 2 meters. So when I participated in dance classes, I don't know, it still looked a bit weird, like a marionette drawn on strings. And you have these joints, which are things moved alongside. You can't just decide to move in a different direction, right? It's not an option. But for an octopus, there's much more flexibility. And that, of course, if you think about the pathological complexity framework I suggested, immediately screams, you get a really high degree of pathological complexity here. How possibly to deal with this range of options? And an ingenious solution that octopuses came up with is a kind of degree of independence between arms, where there is a degree of decision-making happening independently. Now, not completely independently. I mean, there's still exchange of information and so forth, but it does appear like there is a kind of exploring going on with the different arms. And it's unlikely that all of that is experienced by that larger creature, like we might imagine a Cartesian theater. That's just computationally unwieldy, useless. And that has led to some speculations that maybe there might be maybe 9 selves in an octopus. Maybe the independent arms could have their own subjective experience. That's probably the most speculative idea I discuss in my book. But it's one that, from an evolutionary perspective, at least should be taken serious as a hypothesis worth investigating. Perhaps there's something that could be there. And if you think about pathological complexity as really being what consciousness is about, and this common currency can help you make decisions, well, maybe there's something that feels good or bad to be in a state for these arms independently of what the larger system experiences. Perhaps when it's sufficiently meaningless. But of course, if something's very harmful, it makes sense that the whole body would experience that, to quickly go out of there, put some ink out there, escape. change your patterns, hide somewhere. That's a good strategy. Now, when it comes to the specific tests, what you want to look at is life history differences between probably species closely related and how different their lives are. What are they doing with their lives? And one thing you can see, for instance, in species that have um, more simple life histories, well, their brains aren't at large, for one, which at least suggests some reduction on the kind of phenomenological complexity side. You also want to look at their specific experiences, right? I mean, just size of the brain, that could mean all kinds of things. Um, um, Perhaps look at something like the memory capacities between closely related species. How different are they, in fact? What about their experiences of pleasure and pain? How many trade offs can they make between different things? There's very interesting research now on bumblebees, for instance. Insects are
Mhm.
really this edge case scientists now discuss, where it turns out bumblebees aren't just these simple robotic reflex machines. No. Um, if you have these platforms that you can heat and you put a nutritious sugar solution on there, turns out the bumblebees will calculate the value of this solution against how hot it is, against how damaging
Ah.
going there will be to them. They're trading this actively off. And that suggests a kind of common currency, right? And if you can make trade offs among more variables, that's suggestive that you have more complex evaluative experiences, for instance. And admittedly, it's really difficult to test phenomenological experiences. It's always open for scientists to say, well, could this also be done non consciously? But that puts the bar too high. What we should be interested in is not just this one test that's like a proof of consciousness. In the history of consciousness science in animals, that was a mistake people made. You can see that with the mirror test. Many people used to think, well, if an animal can recognize itself in a mirror, then it's conscious. Same with human infants. Luckily, we don't use that as a criterion anymore. We used to not use painkillers on human infants to undergo
Oh.
operations. That's horrific. That had really bad
Yeah.
long-term consequences. Um, yeah, and rather it's about a kind of battery of tests. We try to aggregate all this evidence to have the make inferences to the best explanation. What best explains what goes on here in this animal case, and try to build this large comparative analysis of different species, their mental capacities, and so forth. And that's just how we've done biology. That's how we've made progress in biology. It's not just about these adaptive hypotheses. It's also about studying this diversity of life, having comparative analyses between many different species. And that can then really help us to, well, I mean, if you want to test my framework and if it's wrong, for instance, you could look at different species, um, say, yeah, maybe Asian elephants, African elephants, maybe some closely related species of birds. But then here you could make a link between differences in their life histories. And if those bear out in similar differences in their mental capacities, well, that would be further evidence for my
Mm,
framework. Whereas if it turns out it's completely disconnected, well,
mm.
that's would really count against my framework.
I think that you touched upon there the idea that of not setting the bar so high that it becomes unachievable. Because I think that when a lot of people think about, oh, we can test to what degree an animal is conscious of certain things, they kind of think, well, no, like I can't get inside its mind. And there's a sense in which that's true, at least now. But of course, we can't get in one another's minds either. So
Mm.
if our bar also launches us all into a kind of simple solipsism, then maybe there's that's good reason why the bar ought to be set lower. I think that studying animal cognition is really interesting for consciousness studies, not least because one of the most famous questions in all philosophy of consciousness is what's it like to be a bat? Do you think that as we continue to learn more about animal cognition and animal consciousness and start to get together a framework of along what axes these different beings are phenomenologically complex, that we will be able to get a better understanding of what it's like to be an X. I mean, I'm thinking here about how, I've read Peter Godfrey Smith's book, Other Minds, and I thought by the end of that, I had a better idea of what it would be like to be an octopus. Now, maybe Thomas Nagel would find that totally unsatisfying, but I don't know. That at least suggests to me that we can make progress in this direction, and that what it's like to be a bat might not be as completely absurd and intractable a question to answer as it might initially seem.
That's exactly right. I mean, I'm currently writing a book, and I actually put an argument in there which sounded quite similar to yours, that philosophers actually often make this mistake by just being too radical skeptics. So the bar for animal consciousness to say, well, can we really know what it's like to be a bat? Well, the word really does a lot of work here, because it's kind of a linguistic trick where it just puts the bar so high that, well, you can shift it lower and higher, such that, well, the question immediately becomes, well, of course you can't. But then that very question applied to other humans also says, well, you can't know what it's like to be, say, your mother, a sibling, so forth. And that's clearly not the bar people usually want to defend in the case of humans. So if you say that when it comes to other humans, people will immediately reject solipsism. But if you use the same argument in the case of animals, then suddenly, well, it seems very plausible. So it's kind of a linguistic trick where the implications of the argument are much stronger than we would like it to be. And most people endorsing it would then not endorse the same claim for other animals. And I see that with my students. If I introduce Nagel's experiment, they very quickly go from, oh yeah, we can have some sense of what animals are experiencing, towards complete and utter skepticism. It doesn't matter how much progress we make in the sciences, can't tell us anything. Right? And that seems like a very unfortunate move, where, similarly to radical skepticism about knowledge more generally, that's not what we want. And yeah, your pragmatist leanings, I think, are helpful here. We want concepts of knowledge that are useful. I mean, if you have a concept that says we can't have knowledge, well, then it doesn't seem very useful. Presumably, then you would want some other concept that plays a similar role, where you distinguish between people having evidence for their beliefs or not. So yes, we could distinguish many different concepts of knowledge, perhaps, and some of them will be more useful than others, right? And so when it comes to experience, the experience of other animals, we can have a better or worse understanding of what it's like to be them. And that's really what's important here. And then it's much easier to think, well, yes, the more experiments we get here on what the experiences are like, perhaps some experiments that show how terrible the memory is of animals, that also tells you something perhaps about the experiences they don't have, right? And it would be strange to say we can get that kind of evidence, but not any positive evidence for particular experiences, any evidence that would count in favor of having experiences. I think that wouldn't be the bar we use anywhere else in science. And that's something we need to overcome. And it's quite unfortunate that sometimes a kind of hard-nosed skepticism is confused with being a more rigorous scientist, right? Just being more skeptical. I need more evidence. That means you're the smarter person. That means you're the intellectually more rigorous. Well, not at all. I mean, clearly you can come up with a thought experiment where you show someone, I don't know, maybe you have a beer with other people and you see someone open a package and put something in, and the person sees it and says, I don't know, maybe that's not poison. I can still drink that. Look, you clearly saw it happen. I mean, so depending on what happens, if you see someone approach you with a knife, you don't say, well, they might just want, I don't know, to show me their new knife they bought. No, I mean, you clearly that's completely absurd. We don't use that bar of evidence for any sensible decisions. And it's weird to say in the case of animals that whatever evidence we get from neuroscience, behavior studies, and so forth, that doesn't tell us anything about it, what it's like to be them.
I think there's also something here about, you mentioned earlier about when evolutionary psychology was very young, it couldn't do as much. And I think that, something I was talking to, the last interview I did was with Tommy Blanchard. And something that he emphasizes a lot is that neuroscience itself is a very, very young field. It's a little over hasty to even consider that we might have exactly the same conceptual way of carving up our way of thinking about consciousness. It might be that in 100 years' time, we look at a question like what it's like to be a bat, and we think, well, we don't talk about consciousness in terms of what it's like to. Like isn't that really odd? Like why are you saying what it's like to? We have this completely different conceptual framework that we use. And if you translate the question into that conceptual framework as best you can, then we have a perfectly sensible answer for it. I think this might be, again, it is because neuroscience is so young, there's a lot of room for, well, maybe consciousness is irreducible. And, maybe it is. I'm not suggesting that, it may be that we will just never find a way of reducing it or finding a way to approach it with purely naturalistic frameworks. But I think that it is at the very least far too soon to rule that out. Think about what physics was like 70 years after someone first thought of physics and we could first do simple physical experiments. Well, you probably conclude that, God, if somebody was to approach you and say, oh, well, in 2000 or over 2000 years' time, we're going to be able to create a telescope that can see into quadrillions of miles away. Maybe it's not that far. I don't know. I don't have a good intuitive grasp on large numbers. Then the other person would probably say, no, that's like absurd. That's just simply not possible. But, maybe I'm a big fan of cutting young scientists some slack because it takes a long time. And you think about the amount of conceptual, like scientific paradigms, to use the Kuhn's term, that physics or chemistry or biology or any of the subfields within these very, very ancient schools of thought have gone through. I think that it would be, surprising if it turns out that neuroscience was like, we're at the final paradigm of neuroscience. We're never going to change our conceptual vocabulary any further than this. So yeah, I know. I think that it is at the very least over hasty to conclude that we're never going to be able to describe consciousness in these naturalistic terms. And I think that it's definitely hasty to conclude that on the basis of, I can't imagine what it's like to be a bat at present. I feel like that is, I don't know, I feel like it is a weak peg to hang that particular thesis on.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, one of the things that got me starting to blog about this was a kind of annoyance with the argument against more general naturalistic approach, the kind of standard approach to consciousness, where you think, well, the more we learn from brain science, cognitive science, and so forth, we will progress our understanding of consciousness towards the argument becoming perhaps more popular now. I mean, panpsychism is becoming more popular because they make the argument that, well, it doesn't matter how much progress there is in neuroscience, they could never account for the subjectivity of conscious experience. But you're completely right. I mean, consciousness science or neuroscience, biology, I mean, the sciences are incredibly young. Our species hasn't even been around for that long. And well, if you compare, say, the complexity of landing on the moon versus trying to understand a single cell, turns out, well, almost landing on the moon is easier. I mean, biological systems are so complex. And we keep learning more about them. We keep learning more about how neurons work. People often overestimate. I watched some of your sessions, and you had one episode, I think, where you nicely discussed how people overestimate how much we know about neuroscience. When someone uses some neuroscience speak, then immediately people will give more credence to whatever claim is made about our psychology, because people think neuroscience is so advanced. And maybe that's what's going on with some philosophers who think, oh, neuroscience is this really advanced field and it still can't account for consciousness, so it's hopeless. But no, neuroscience is so young and we still need to learn so much. It's still such a young field. And so there's so much more progress to be done, and I'm very excited about that progress, seeing it in my lifetime.
Yes, yeah. I think that, to use a related or to use a nearby field, I suppose, with psychology, it's only just over 100 years ago that the concept of the Oedipal complex was like the pinnacle of psychological theorizing. That was and Freud wrote that down. He thought it was going to change the world.
Yeah.
And, we've held on to aspects of Freud, but we haven't held on to that. We have a different way of conceiving of a lot of human psychology now. It's interesting. I actually think that, generally, we're quite harsh in hindsight to the founders of disciplines because they get a lot wrong. And I always think, well, yeah, of course they get a lot. Like Antoine Lavoisier got a lot wrong about chemistry, but it was still a very important contribution, right? We don't expect these very early innovators of fields to get everything right. It's a bit like saying, "God, that idiot Newton, he didn't get curved space time, did he?" It's like, well, no, but we can do a lot more. We could do a lot more because of his contributions than we would have done if he hadn't had written it all down and formalized calculus and all sorts. I think that we often don't have that good of an appreciation between how young a science is and how long scientific progress takes, and how it's not just a matter of collecting facts. It's also a matter of whole ways of thinking about those facts get shifted over time. We have whole new conceptual categories.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I say your critique of analytic philosophy sort of stemmed out of a critique of panpsychism. And panpsychism, I think, has kind of had a bit of a resurgence. At the very least, it's certainly more popular now than it was when I was an undergrad, for example. It wasn't even mentioned in the philosophy of mind stuff that we did when I was 18, 19. So, A, why do you think that panpsychism has seen such a resurgence? And B, what are your primary problems with it? Is it just that you think that there's not really a good enough positive case for it? Or do you think there are good reasons to reject it as a possibility, like positive, negative reasons almost, to reject panpsychism?
Good. Yeah. I actually think, there's some promising arguments one can make in favor of panpsychism, and those need to be met. And in fact, I think maybe sort of contemporary analytic philosophers of mind reject it too quickly compared to naturalist philosophers who are more justified in saying, well, that's just not a good model compared to the one we're currently developing in the sciences, because the argumentative tools they use are very similar to other people defending views like perhaps idealism or dualism. Now, I think based on the progress we get from the neurosciences, these views in philosophy are becoming increasingly less promising. In fact, it would be weird if this progress in the neuroscience of consciousness and the sort of behavioral studies on consciousness wouldn't account for more evidence in favor of a naturalistic, materialist view of the mind. And one thing I think that people with panpsychism sort of think is, if you think consciousness is fundamental, right? You introspect into your own experiences and you think, well, doesn't seem to make sense that you get this usual evolutionary process where you get just gradually consciousness built. No, it's a fundamental property. And so in order to make sense of that, well, then you need to say, it must have always been there. And that's a good answer to give then, I think. But why should we think of consciousness in this way? I don't think consciousness is fundamental in this way. I think it's a multidimensional complex property, and it's gradually built, right? So you get these gradations. When you think of cases like insects, for instance, there might be cases where it's really hard for us to say whether an entity is conscious or non-conscious, and rather than think it's a binary answer, well, the best scientific answer isn't just that there's a kind of vagueness in the sense of uncertainty. We just don't know. No, there's a different kind of vagueness in the sense of there being a kind of proto-quasi-consciousness. Dan Dennett liked to use a term like hemi-demi minds, semi-demi minds. And that's quite right. For a lot of categories we have, it's not just about a kind of hard line in the sand that's crossed at one point, but you get this gradation. And when it comes to complex traits like eyes, We know that people thought Darwinian evolution couldn't be right, because it would be so hard to imagine um, what it would be like for eyes to gradually evolve. How could that possibly be explained? And that's true for a lot of complex traits. And I don't think that they're similar from consciousness. I think consciousness is one of the most complex biological traits. And so, like all others, it must have evolved in this gradual fashion. But admittedly, when we introspect, this light switch metaphor is quite compelling. Either you're knocked out, right? Completely non conscious, or you're awake. There's a kind of wakefulness. You're experiencing things. But perhaps even in our case, we can think of these marginal cases like waking up from a coma, waking up from usual sleep, uh, maybe some states where humans are on psychedelic drugs. Maybe that even enhances your consciousness. Who knows? I mean, some people want to defend that. If you think about these different dimensions of consciousness, say, certainly in my framework with phenomenological complexity, someone taking a psychedelic drug, we should be able to then account for how they start to change in these dimensions. And it turns out, well, your unity of experience becomes more flowing. Your experience of time becomes quite different. Moments or short moments can feel like a long time can feel like a short time. And so when it comes to these metaphors, well, some of them are helpful to perhaps favor one view, but it's not clear these metaphors are the right ones to use. And so different metaphors might be more useful to think about these strange biological cases, especially when it comes to other biological entities, once we move beyond the human case. So even if the light switch metaphor seems to account for our own experience, I think it's really unhelpful when it comes to this very gradual process in the evolution of mind, where it's not even this one scale along which you get differences, not as many scales, many dimensions along which things differ. And you get a kind of multi-dimensional phenomenological complexity space where you could put different organisms, right? And that gives you a very different view. And so the difference between a panpsychist and the evolutionary radical gradualist really then is, well, on the one hand, either you think it's fundamental, it can't be disassociated into these different states that could more gradually emerge, whereas it must have always been there, and then there can be more complex forms of it. And these are very different views. But I think in line with science, the gradualist evolutionary picture is much more promising. And once you take that view seriously, I don't think panpsychism as a rival theory out there is then worth pursuing all that much, because it requires much more radical changes, much more radical commitments to particular views on metaphysics that are controversial. Commitments to introspection, commitments to the very tools of analytic philosophy I earlier criticized. Um, but that's not to say that we couldn't get more evidence in this naturalist sense, perhaps for something like panpsychism. Maybe we get more evidence for that. But as it looks at the moment, um, it seems like we get much more support for this kind of zoopsychist view, where it's about the history of animals, the origins of the first nervous systems, and this is in this history we can identify the origins of mind.
Mm, that's really interesting. I do think that one thing that I've um, you know reading a fair amount of presentations of panpsychism, I've slowly ended up seeing that either the more plausible that panpsychism is presented, the closer it seems to be to not doing anything, if that makes sense. Like as in, I can find a kind of proto-panpsychism very convincing, in the sense that it seems to be there's these proto-conscious properties, but they don't really do anything until they're put in the right order. But then I did some further reflection. I realized that the reason that I think that's so convincing is because that kind of doesn't say, like, nothing hangs on it. That that's essentially just physicalism or naturalism restated. With what does the proto-panpsychist think? The proto-panpsychist thinks that there are these properties that aren't really conscious in the way that we'd recognize, but are in some sense and in certain arrangements they give rise to states we'd recognize as conscious. And I tend to think, well, that sort of just is what the physicalist thinks, just with slightly different language. But then, and I think the benefit of a view like that is that you can say the scientific literature doesn't contradict this. This is perfectly compatible with not only any observation we have of the mind now and the brain now, but any possible observation of those things. But I kind of think, well, it only does that because it seems to be not only empirically equivalent, but almost theoretically equivalent. Like, I'm not quite sure what the relevant difference is then between those two views. But if panpsychism is saying more than that, and that it actually does have it makes a pragmatic difference to how we will observe and approach the mind, then at the very least, it seems like it will have to be supported by empirical evidence and experimentation. Because then but I sometimes feel like in presentations of panpsychism, there's almost a Motte and Bailey thing going on where these two positions are leapt between quite quickly. I'm not saying that's deliberate or dishonest or anything like that, but I sometimes do see, panpsychism isn't unscientific because it doesn't contradict anything to do with observation, but nonetheless it's significant because it changes the way that we will experience and view the mind. But then these two things seem like they're in tension. It seems like the more plausible you make panpsychism, potentially the more trivial it becomes. And the less trivial you make panpsychism, the less I can see it fitting neatly into our pre-existing neuroscientific frameworks. And then it sort of becomes maybe a prediction about a problem that we might come across at some point that we'll have to appeal to a sort of panpsychist experiment to solve. And that might be true, but it might not be true. It just seems to me to be then a prediction about our future inquiry that may or may not be the case. But I may have just missed something in the panpsychist literature, but I have noticed a kind of two forms of panpsychism with oppositional strengths that can't be reconciled. You can't give both of these accounts together.
Yeah, allow me to read out a quote I put in a recent paper of mine, which was born out of a special issue on my book, where a bunch of philosophers and scientists wrote up commentaries applying the framework also to different species, like I mentioned before, elephants. And it gave me this opportunity to put in a story, a kind of account told by Keith Frankish, who was at a consciousness conference around Iceland with Dan Dennett and Philip Goff. And here Philip Goff said to Dennett, sitting on a bench, I believe, look, panpsychism doesn't contradict anything that you believe or that you want to say about how the physical world works, or about evolution, or about the kinds of evolutionary explanations you give. All of that's perfectly compatible with panpsychism. Panpsychism doesn't say it doesn't work like that. It just says there's an extra dimension, the intrinsic nature of all these processes that you talk about. So there are these evolved brain mechanisms which achieve all the effects, but there's also this intrinsic nature to them as well. So really all I'm doing is seeking to expand on the kind of work that you do. And you could join us and still do everything you're doing, but you'd have this extra bit as well. So kindly inviting Dan Dennett to join in becoming a panpsychist. How did Dan respond? Well, he looked a bit mischievous and said, well, tell me, is there any money for doing this extra work you're talking about? Is there any grant money available for panpsychism? Philip Goff replied, well, yeah, it's becoming quite popular. There's quite a lot of funding available for this. And then Dennett said, well, then it sounds quite attractive, because there's no work to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of a similar mind with Dennett to do with panpsychism. It could just be that I've missed something, and maybe, if I interview a panpsychist, they'll be able to completely disabuse me of it. But I struggled exactly to see what it adds to the naturalistic story. And if it does add it, then it seems like there should be some way of testing or inquiring as to whether the proposed addition works.
Yeah, that's right.
But then again, I know that to a certain extent that does rest on me being quite pragmatist in my meta philosophy, which is which is its own controversial position. So I don't know. Maybe I should have a bit more. I
Yeah, I
should
mean,
reflect on
you
whether I'm
mentioned
right
that
in
it's
that.
consistent with science, and I think that's sort of the crux of the issue. A lot of philosophers call themselves naturalists. But are they naturalists in my sense? No. I mean, in that case, um, most analytic philosophers would actually be naturalists, right? You get surveys on phil people where a lot of members of the philosophy profession can participate in the survey every couple of years. But they use naturalism in a quite loose sense of just not being inconsistent with the sciences. But well, if you have a range of available theories within the sciences, clearly that's not your only um, theoretical criteria for what makes a good theory, that you're compatible with the evidence. There's many others. There's things like predictive power, explanatory power, generality, and so forth. And if you then evaluate panpsychism against other theories, you don't have to say, well, it's just a different metaphysics. No, you're also suffering along the lines of many of these criteria we might want from theories, many of the criteria we use to evaluate alternative theories. And so I think panpsychism has to answer them. I mean, if you say that your theory doesn't have any predictive power, doesn't have the kind of explanatory power we usually want, well, that's certainly then a downside. And that's something to answer to.
Yeah, yeah. No, so does it have strong positive reasons to adopt it? And so far, I've not been convinced that it does. And I think part of that is because I think that a lot of the arguments I've seen for panpsychism, and certainly the ones that I think are more plausible for me, start with the standpoint that okay, we know that the mind is on principle irreducible to naturalistic observations. We know that that's a non-starter. Then okay, so now we've got dualism or panpsychism, and I agree that if you give me a choice between dualism and panpsychism, given that initial premise, then yes, I would go with panpsychism. I just don't. I don't agree with that initial premise. So I kind of a lot of it doesn't quite get off the ground to me. I think that the most convincing argument I've seen given for it was by Galen Strawson, who did kind of do that argument structure. But again, I thought that's lovely. If I accepted that premise, I would accept the consequences of it. But I just don't.
Yeah, I mean, there is some unfortunate writing by Galen Strawson against Dan Dennett, where he very
Oh.
much strawmans him and says, "Oh, you're not explaining consciousness at all." Dennett responds with, well, I'm just not explaining your kind of concept of consciousness. And that's a different thing. And we certainly should think about whether the definitions we have for particular phenomena we have really captured them. There's different theories out there. And it's very easy then to dismiss some theories with these kind of rhetorical tricks, which are unfortunate because then they mislead us from really investigating views like illusionism, which for one I think is not a great term because then it makes people think, oh, consciousness is just an illusion, and you keep seeing it's terrible. Just I mean, everywhere on Twitter, someone writes X now, blue sky. I don't know. People say, well, if consciousness is an illusion, it's still experience. So gotcha, it's still real and it can't be an illusion. And it's, yeah,
I think
cases like this.
Frankish has some
Yeah.
great right. Oh, Frankish was the person reading him where I was like, okay, yeah, I think I know what illusionism, like I can get myself into the illusionist mindset now. Because it is to a certain extent just like a branding problem. In the illusionists don't think that you don't have a mind. They deny that mind has a particular characteristic that makes it philosophically problematic. I don't know. I don't know. It wouldn't be another name for illusionists. Maybe like anti-phenomenalists. But they're not really anything to do with phenomenalism. So it just kind of
Right.
there's no right word.
Yeah. Keith Frankish actually wrote a reply in the special issue in my book, and he was very much calling me out for still using terms like qualia, phenomenology, phenomenological complexity, right? We're accounting for this quasi qualia. And what is the purpose of using language like that? And I very much answered that I am not engaged in this discussion where I let the sort of the anti-physicalists just define the terms of the debate, and then you're left having to use terms like, oh well, I am the anti-consciousness person. I'm against qualitative experience. It's just terrible branding. But why let the others define how the terms should be used? I mean, it may very well be true that many philosophers define qualia in a particular way. Even David Chalmers, though, says that he wants to use the term in a very deflationary sense to just capture this experience, what it's like. And you can define these terms in many different ways. And when I use these terms, like quasi-qualia, for instance, I'm much more interested in what we talked before about the cases between non-consciousness and consciousness as we know it, these kind of marginal cases in the evolutionary history of experience where neither term fits really well. But when it comes to terms like qualia, I just think in the way I think about philosophy, I'm a radical revisionist. If there's scientific progress in our understanding of consciousness, well, then terms like qualia should just reflect this progress. We shouldn't just, just stop using them, use different terms, because that's kind of weird in the case of the mind, because they're meant to capture these qualitative experiences. And for many cases in science, terms like motion and the like, gravity, we didn't stop using them because we once defined them in different ways. They just were accounted for by different scientific theories. And so a deeper understanding of them changed how you think about that. But for a lot of terms that are based on these direct experiences of how we live our lives, it's really hard to try to be an eliminativist, because it will give people always this wrong impression that you're saying this concept so central to your ordinary life isn't real. You get the same problem really with eliminativist materialism in the case of beliefs and desires. If you just hear that, what do you mean I don't have desires? I like chocolate ice cream. I believe that there's a 5 p.m. right now, something like that. And so it's unhelpful. And I think we should be, if we're naturalists, strong naturalists, well, then this conceptual analysis of terms, this focus on intuitions, isn't all that important. We shouldn't put it as this holy grail. We shouldn't put too much emphasis on the definitions and how philosophers decades ago chose to define them. No, we should be radically open to revise them, because that's exactly how sciences advance. Theorizing changes how we use terms, because that's just how naturalist progress works.
I mean, you actually touched upon this right at the beginning of your book with your discussion of health, where you bring up the concept of actually, one way of thinking of philosophical theorizing when it comes to the meaning of a term is to say, here is the term and here is what I think it already means. But another way, which I think is a slightly more promising way, is to say, okay, we have a set of terms. How can we most usefully use them? Like, how, if we're going to, sure, because language is polysemous, these all mean different things. And when we're not going to be able to exhaust their uses by sitting down and thinking about them. But there are more useful ways to carve up the world in terms of how to then go about interpreting it and theorizing about it and interacting with it. If I had a word that was both that was, a disjunctively defined word and it referred to books or lamps, then somebody could come along and say, yeah, I know that like you mean books or lamps by that word, but you could cut this word into two different words and you would just be able to navigate your world much, much more smoothly. And I think that's the kind of conceptual work that philosophy can, at its best, do very well. But it requires, I think, a very different attitude towards what it means to do conceptual work. 'Cause it's no longer conceptual analysis; it's a conceptual engineering. But I have a lot of time for conceptual engineering, partly because of the experimental results demonstrating how much our conceptual scheme, for want of a better term, affects how we interpret the world and how we act in the
Mm.
world. I think that's a genuinely pragmatically useful philosophical task. It's amazing how far I think sometimes you can go down in a discussion with someone about the meaning of a term, and then, maybe 40 minutes in, realize that what you want to do is conceptual engineering and what the other person wants to do is conceptual analysis, and then think, oh no, that's a shame, because
Right.
they can look deceptively similar, but one is kind of forward looking and the other is backwards looking. And I think the forward looking conceptual engineering approach is much more promising, partly because, as I say, cognitive linguistics, I think, as much as anything has been conclusively demonstrated, I think that cognitive linguistics has pretty conclusively demonstrated that polysemy is the sea in which language swims. There's just no getting around it. Maybe there are temporary ways of getting around it if you sit down and operationalize all your definitions. But in the world of everyday speech, there's just no way of getting around polysemy. It is just everywhere. It's not like this weird thing that happens sometimes. It's like, no, it's constant and dizzying.
Mm.
Um,
Right.
but
It's great
that
getting
doesn't
into meta philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that there aren't more or less useful ways of carving up the world. It makes a difference whether you have, I just trying to think of a good empirical result here. But I think I'm getting this right. That having a more detailed kind of emotional map affects how well people deal with certain stresses. So that may have just been not replicated. I'll put it up on the screen if I found out that this study was debunked. But that at least suggests to me that there is something very useful about having rich conceptual categories in different areas. But there's nothing about that constrains us to analyzing our old conceptual categories. We can come up with great new conceptual categories based on our particular needs and situations. I think that is a solid task for philosophy to do. And yeah, I think that in some ways that's that's where I'd like to see what used to be conceptual analysis work go. Because, and as you say, I think, the concept change over time is something that does occur, and it does occur in line with human needs. And consciously thinking about that, I think could be very, very fruitful. Yeah, I think the illusionism thing is really interesting. I think illusionism just is a very, very widely misunderstood philosophy. I think part of that is because maybe the illusionist is right in that I suspect the illusionist probably is right in the sense that we will one day have a vocabulary to talk about consciousness that doesn't involve these terminologies. But, and maybe this is my kind of naturalistic side battling with my sympathies for illusionism, I think that maybe the time to adopt that terminology is when it comes about, or when it seems like there's an alternative conceptual scheme rich enough that we can step into it fully. And I'm sure that maybe the Frankish would argue that we already have that. I'm a little bit more skeptical, but that's not to say that one day it will be. That's not to say that it's impossible. I think one day that probably will come about.
You get one criticism Frankish made, for instance, of my book was that I defend a kind of hybrid view between functionalism and a materialist identity theory, because he thought, well, why not just commit yourself to functionalism, perhaps a fine-grained view of functionalism? And that's fine as far as goes. But if you're a naturalist, there's no need to commit yourself before there's much more progress in the science of consciousness to functionalism or an identity theory or perhaps a hybrid view. That just seems really weird to me, as if you were to do the metaphysics before you do the scientific investigation. And that's exactly what you were just saying. Let's hold back a little bit. I mean, let's just try to work with these perhaps temporary placeholders of concepts, several explanatory schemes, the theories, the concepts we come up with. Let's come up with more metaphors. Perhaps they might help us to make progress in our understanding, as long as they're useful. Let's think about what purpose they are put to use. And I think this, you mentioned conceptual engineering, that's a very beneficial turn in philosophy now, where people are much more concerned with the question, what are we even doing here? What role should this concept play? I mentioned the concept health before. That would have been really useful in the past, because people trained in philosophy sometimes go into this field thinking, well, we're going to understand reality itself. And then you engage in this conceptual analysis of terms, but you start to realize, well, just understanding how my intuitions about this term perhaps doesn't really capture an essence we're trying, at least something like a real pattern in nature we're trying to capture. In the case of health, this should be really clear. I mean, if you engage different people in a debate with each other and they have different views, if you just ask them, what purpose is this concept meant to play? People might respond with, oh, they're just trying to capture how people use it. Yes, but people use it in different ways, clearly, right? You acknowledge that. And so why would they use it in different ways? Well, very plausibly, because it's put to different uses. I mean, someone might just try to capture, all right, here you have these doctors trying to identify whether someone has a particular pathology, kind of statistical definition. Do they have enough of these criteria? Okay, they have this disease. And then you might have someone who thinks, well, this is an important social justice issue. Whether something counts as a pathology means there should be medical resources going towards it and so forth. A very different view. If you think about the history, you might think, well, has someone pathologized this in the past? Maybe something like witchcraft or something along those lines. Really weird cases where people thought of diseases. There's a lot of good feminist literature on pathologizing differences between women and men. That's really bad, right? And so, yeah, asking people, trying to make explicit what it is you're engaged in, what is the activity you're doing, for which purpose are you trying to make this concept better, that can be really helpful to make progress in all of these discussions.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, I really agree. Even I think actually the philosophy of health and mental health is a very good example of that, because a lot of our definitions of what a mental illness is are butt up against the kind of the lack of neat ready-made neurological correlates for our mental illness categories. And one way that at least I haven't actually talked about this on channel, but one way in which I've suggested that this might be one way forward through this philosophical issue in the past is that, well, you can start carving up these categories not based on, for now at least, not based on neurological correlates, since we don't have those in quite as much detail as we'd like, but instead how to fruitfully respond, react, and treat something. Which again, is kind of a forward-looking way at the issue, and having that as a kind of placeholder philosophy. But yeah, I mean, just to kind of wrap up the interview, which has been absolutely wonderful. I've really enjoyed this. I always ask people this at the end of an interview. What's the most interesting idea that you've come across in the past year, and why?
That's a very good question, certainly.
It can be totally unrelated to anything that we've discussed today. Just like something that's caught your eye.
Now, I think it will be a scientific study rather than a philosophy experiment, but perhaps that's not too surprising in my case as a naturalist philosopher. Yeah, no. There was a study recently where they demonstrated for the very first time tool use in cows. You might have seen this, I'm not sure.
Oh.
And so there was
No,
this
I
cow that
haven't.
used a broomstick to scratch itself, both its back and the bottom, using in fact a different end of this broom to scratch itself, because it was more useful this way. And now in the past, sometimes humans were defined as the tool-using animal. And that has been long abandoned because we found tool use in so many other animals. And this is something I think that we should pay much more attention to. Just because humans with their hands, well, we evolved to make use of tools in more ways, stones and the like, has been really useful for us. I mean, look around. We have microphones and all kinds of things. We've made use of tools. Now we have machines building machines for us, even better. But for many animals, just because we haven't looked at them having a particular ability doesn't mean they lack it. And that's really important in animal consciousness, animal cognition research. Very often, historically, scientists have assumed that just because we haven't found evidence, they don't have this ability. But very often, in fact, most often, scientists just haven't even tried to investigate this question. Why has no one tried in all this time to teach a cow how to use a tool and so forth.
Mhm.
And that's something we should really look at more. Try to think more about the intelligence, especially of the animals we farm. Because it's very easy, especially with animals we eat, to think, well, no, they're all not that intelligent, so their suffering won't be as bad and so forth. And so tool use in farm animals, there has been a lot of research very recently that has been very surprising to me. And it's always very astonishing.
Wow. Yeah, and then tool use in animals is. I mean, I remember first reading the study where it's by Nicky Clayton's lab, where the crow puts the rocks in the jar in the little
Yeah.
cylinder to raise the water level to. And I just thought that's amazing because like I think I could put a toddler in front of a puzzle like that and it would take them a while to figure out the I mean, how long did it take Archimedes? This just kind of and then it's crow just doing it seemingly with very little issue. It is animal cognition. I think is an absolutely fascinating field. And I think you're absolutely right that it has so much to offer regarding the way we think about consciousness more generally, because we're not the only conscious beings. We are a minority of the conscious beings.
Mm.
But yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find you?
On my website, walterveit.com, my YouTube channel, which will be linked here, my Substack. Just type my name into Google, all that should come up.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much
Thanks
for
so
coming
much
on the
for
show.
having me.
This has been such a pleasure.